She's finally starting to fade. Another month, maybe 2, and we'll be set for life. My daughter Karen's voice drifted through the thin walls of my bedroom, cold and calculating as winter wind. I pressed my ear against the door, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it downstairs. The hardwood floor felt like ice beneath my bare feet, and my flannel nightgown provided no warmth against the chill that was spreading through my bones, not from illness, but from the horrifying realization of what my own children were planning. Welcome to Grandma's Untold Truth. My name is Margaret Sullivan and I am here to tell my truth. Kindly like and share this video to others to learn 1 or 2 things from my story. Let's continue. The life insurance alone is $300,000, my son David added, his voice carrying the same greedy excitement I'd heard when he was 8 years old, counting his Halloween candy. Plus her pension, the house, all those antique collections she's been hoarding. We're talking close to $1 million total. The sound of ice clinking in glasses punctuated their conversation, as if they were toasting my impending death. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat as I listened to my own children calculate my worth like livestock at auction. I gripped the doorframe, my arthritic fingers digging into the painted wood until my knuckles went white. 74 years old, and I was discovering that the 2 people I'd given my life to raising were nothing more than vultures circling overhead, waiting for me to die. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, family photos lining the walls, Karen's graduation, David's wedding, grandchildren I'd helped raise. All those memories now tainted by the knowledge that they saw me as nothing more than a payday waiting to happen. What if she doesn't die fast enough? Karen's voice carried an edge of impatience that made my blood run cold. I mean, she's been dying for 6 months now, and she's still moving around, still cooking, still. Her words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. They weren't just waiting for me to die naturally. They were considering alternatives. My breath caught in my chest, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from gasping out loud. But as I stood there in that dark hallway, listening to my children plan my demise, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing despair I should have felt, a different emotion began building in my chest. It started as a small spark of anger, then grew into something harder, sharper. They thought I was a helpless old woman fading away in her bedroom. They had no idea that Margaret Sullivan had spent 45 years as a private investigator, that she'd built a career on uncovering lies and bringing down people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. They were about to learn that this dying woman had more fight left in her than they ever imagined. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, matching the cold reality that had settled over my life like a shroud. I made my way slowly to the kitchen, deliberately shuffling my slippers against the linoleum to maintain the illusion of frailty that had apparently convinced my children I was at death's door. The smell of coffee filled the small space, a familiar comfort that now felt tainted by last night's revelations. Karen sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with the casual indifference of someone planning a grocery list instead of her mother's funeral. "Morning, Mom," she said without looking up, her voice carrying that practiced tone of forced patience I'd been hearing more often lately. "How are you feeling today?" The question sounded rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing the right amount of concern to show when the insurance investigators eventually came asking questions. I poured my coffee with deliberately shaky hands, letting the cup rattle against the saucer just enough to seem authentic, but not enough to spill and waste good coffee. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who looked older than her years, silver hair gone thin and wispy, shoulders permanently hunched from decades of bending over case files, skin mapped with age spots and worry lines. But what Karen couldn't see were the sharp blue eyes that had spent 4 decades reading people's lies, cataloging their tells, building cases that sent criminals to prison. She saw a failing body. She missed the calculating mind that was already 3 steps ahead of whatever scheme she and David were planning. "I'm tired, dear," I replied, adding just the right tremor to my voice. "So very tired." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was exhausted, not from illness, but from years of pretending I didn't notice how they looked at me like a burden, how they calculated the cost of my medications against the value of my estate, how they spoke about me in the third person even when I was sitting right there. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the yellow wallpaper I'd hung 30 years ago now seeming faded and oppressive. David arrived an hour later, his expensive suit crisp despite the early hour. His smile a practiced mask that probably worked well in his corporate job but couldn't fool someone who'd spent decades studying deception. "Hey, Mom," he said, kissing my forehead with lips that felt cold against my skin. "Karen says you're having another rough day." He exchanged a look with his sister. Quick, meaningful, the kind of silent communication that told me they'd been planning this conversation. As they sat across from me at the table where I'd helped them with homework, where I'd celebrated their birthdays and graduations, I realized this was my advantage. They saw a sick old woman who couldn't possibly overhear their whispered conversations or understand their coded glances. They had no idea that Margaret Sullivan had built her reputation on being underestimated, on letting suspects think they were smarter than the quiet woman taking notes in the corner. My children were about to become my final case, and unlike my previous investigations, this one was personal. Very personal. 3 days of careful listening had filled in the horrible details of their plan. I sat in my rocking chair by the window, pretending to doze while they whispered in the kitchen below, their voices carrying through the old house's thin floors like confessions in a confessional. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting shadow patterns that shifted and moved like the pieces of their conspiracy falling into place. My notebook lay hidden beneath my knitting, filled with dates, times, and direct quotes that would make any prosecutor salivate. "The insurance company requires a death certificate within 30 days for the full payout," Karen was explaining to David, her voice businesslike as if she were discussing a real estate transaction instead of insurance fraud. "I've already spoken to Dr. Morrison about Mom's decline. He's been documenting her symptoms for months." The sound of papers rustling made my blood run cold. They'd been planning this for months, carefully building a medical paper trail that would support their eventual claim that I'd died of natural causes. My hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair so tight I could feel splinters digging into my palms. Dr. Morrison had been my physician for 15 years, a man I'd trusted with my health and my concerns. Now I understood why my recent visits had felt different, why he'd seemed more interested in documenting my complaints than actually treating them. Every ache I'd mentioned, every moment of fatigue, every senior moment had been carefully recorded as evidence of my supposed deterioration. "What about the funeral arrangements?" David asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely reached my ears. "People will expect to see a body." The casual way he discussed my non-existent corpse made my stomach churn. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart beating strong and steady beneath my ribs, very much alive despite their plans to declare me dead. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were planning my funeral while I sat 20 feet above them, very much breathing. But it was Karen's response that pushed me past the point of horror into something harder and more dangerous. "I've been researching cremation options," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as discussing dinner plans. "Once we have the death certificate, we can have a closed casket service and immediate cremation. No one will ever know there was no body." The rocking chair creaked as I leaned forward, my detective instincts finally overriding my maternal heartbreak. They thought they had planned the perfect crime, but they'd made the classic mistake of underestimating their mark. Margaret Sullivan had spent 45 years catching people who thought they were smarter than everyone else, and her own children were about to discover that blood meant nothing when it came to justice. I might look like a helpless old woman fading away in her chair, but I was about to show them what happened when you tried to bury someone who knew exactly how to dig her way out of any grave they thought they'd prepared. The manila envelope arrived on Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who looked uncomfortable when Karen answered the door with theatrical tears already streaming down her face. I watched from my bedroom window as she practiced her grief, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while signing for what I knew would be the insurance documents that would seal my fate. The October wind rattled the old windows, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with seeing my daughter rehearse mourning my death. An hour later, I made my way slowly downstairs, each step deliberately labored to maintain my failing health charade. The envelope lay open on the kitchen counter, its contents spread like evidence at a crime scene. life insurance forms, medical examiner contact information, and a checklist titled Steps Following Death of Policyholder were arranged in neat piles. My own death was being organized with the efficiency of a business transaction, complete with timeline and action items. "Oh, Mom," Karen said, quickly gathering the papers when she noticed me shuffling into the kitchen. "You startled me. I was just handling some paperwork." Her voice carried that artificial sweetness I'd learned to recognize over 40 years of interviewing suspects, the tone people used when they were caught in the middle of something they shouldn't be doing. She stuffed the documents back into the envelope, but not before I caught sight of a form with date of death left blank, waiting to be filled in when convenient. The coffee pot sat cold on the counter, forgotten in her haste to hide evidence. I moved toward it with the careful steps of someone whose joints ached, though in reality my body felt more alive than it had in months. Adrenaline had a way of sharpening everything. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer, my mind more focused than it had been since I'd closed my last case 5 years ago. "What kind of paperwork, dear?" I asked, letting confusion cloud my voice while my detective instincts catalogued every detail of her nervous behavior. "Just insurance things," she replied, her fingers drumming against the counter in a rhythm that screamed anxiety. "You know, making sure everything's in order. For the future." The future. As if my death was an inevitable business appointment rather than the life of a woman who'd raised her, sacrificed for her, loved her unconditionally for 46 years. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one that said "World's Best Mom," and wondered if she felt even a flicker of irony. David arrived as I sat at the table, sipping coffee and pretending to struggle with the newspaper crossword. He moved with the confident stride of someone who believed his plan was foolproof, kissing my forehead with lips that felt like ice. "Morning, Mom. How's the puzzle coming?" His eyes swept the table, looking for signs that I might have seen the insurance documents. What he didn't know was that Margaret Sullivan had photographed every page with a small camera hidden in her reading glasses, a retirement gift from my former partner that I'd never thought I'd need to use on my own family. 7 across is stumping me," I said, tapping my pen against the paper. 7 letters. One who investigates crimes. I looked up at him with innocent blue eyes, watching as he glanced nervously at the manila envelope Karen was clutching like a guilty secret. "Detective," he answered quickly, then seemed to realize what he'd said. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning he couldn't possibly understand. Not yet. By Friday, I'd established a routine that would have made my old surveillance teams proud. Each morning, I played the confused elderly woman, shuffling around in my bathrobe while Karen and David whispered their plans in corners they thought were safe from my supposedly failing hearing. What they didn't realize was that 45 years of investigating had taught me to read lips, and their careful whispers were as clear to me as if they were shouting their conspiracy from the rooftops. The spare bedroom had become my command center. Behind boxes of old case files that my children assumed were just more junk Mom couldn't bear to throw away, I'd set up equipment that would have impressed my former colleagues. Digital recording devices, a high-resolution camera, and most importantly, a secure phone that couldn't be traced back to my regular number. Every conversation was being documented, every movement logged, every piece of evidence carefully catalogued with a methodical precision that had made me one of the best private investigators in the state. My first call was to Detective Ray Martinez, a former colleague who'd moved to the insurance fraud division after his retirement from homicide. His voice carried genuine warmth when he recognized mine, the kind of professional respect I'd earned through decades of solid casework. "Maggie Sullivan, I heard you'd retired. What's got you calling the department?" The familiar sound of a police station buzzed in the background, phones ringing, conversations overlapping, the organized chaos I'd once called home. "I need help with a case, Ray," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Insurance fraud, conspiracy, possibly worse. But the suspects are close to me." The silence on the other end told me he understood the implications. Ray had been around long enough to know that family cases were always the worst, that the betrayal cut deeper when it came from blood relatives. When I finished explaining the situation, his whistle was low and disbelieving. Jesus, Maggie. Your own kids. Are you sure about this? His voice carried the concern of an old friend mixed with the skepticism of a seasoned detective. I understood his disbelief. It was the same sick feeling I'd been carrying since that first night I'd overheard their plans. Children planning their parents' deaths belonged in horror movies, not in the real world. But my recordings didn't lie, and my photographs told a story that no loving parent should ever have to document. The hardest part was maintaining my act while building my case. During the day, I'd shuffle around in my slippers, letting Karen help me with simple tasks while I memorized her schedule, her contacts, her habits. I'd sit in my chair by the window, appearing to nap while actually photographing David's meetings with men in expensive suits. Meetings that happened in my driveway, just close enough to my house to seem casual but far enough away that they thought their voices wouldn't carry. What they didn't account for was the directional microphone I'd hidden in my garden gnome, positioned to capture every word of their insurance fraud discussions. By Sunday night, I had enough evidence to bury them both, but I wasn't ready to spring my trap yet. Margaret Sullivan had never settled for just solving a case. She'd always made sure the guilty parties faced consequences that matched their crimes. My children wanted me dead so badly they were willing to commit fraud, forgery, and potentially worse to make it happen. They were about to learn what it felt like to attend a funeral for someone who was very much alive, and very much ready for revenge. Monday morning brought the closest call yet, and my heart nearly stopped when I heard David's footsteps on the stairs earlier than usual. I'd been reviewing photographs in my makeshift command center, evidence of their conspiracy spread across the desk like pieces of a deadly puzzle. The sound of his approach sent me scrambling to hide everything, my arthritis forgotten in the rush of adrenaline as I shoved documents into hiding places and closed laptop screens. "Mom, are you up?" His voice carried a note of suspicion that made my skin crawl. I quickly pulled on my bathrobe and mussed my hair, then opened the door with the slow movements of someone who'd been sleeping deeply. "David, what's wrong, dear?" The concern in my voice was genuine, though not for the reasons he might think. I was concerned about how close I'd come to being discovered, about what might happen if they realized I knew about their plans. "I thought I heard voices up here," he said, his eyes scanning my face for signs of deception. 45 years of investigative work had taught me how to maintain eye contact while lying, how to control my breathing and body language to project innocence even when guilt was eating me alive. "Just talking to myself," I replied with a self-deprecating laugh. "You know how us old folks get. Sometimes the only intelligent conversation I have all day is with myself." But David wasn't satisfied. He pushed past me into the spare bedroom, his gaze sweeping over boxes and furniture with the systematic attention of someone conducting a search. My heart hammered as he approached the desk where I'd been working, but I'd managed to clear it just in time. The only thing visible was an old photo album, open to pictures from his childhood, a perfect prop that explained why I might have been up here reminiscing. "You're getting sentimental in your old age, Mom," he said, but there was something cold in his voice that hadn't been there when he was actually the little boy in those photographs. I watched him study the room one more time, his lawyer's instincts clearly telling him something was off even if he couldn't put his finger on what. When he finally left, I waited a full 10 minutes before retrieving my hidden evidence, my hands shaking not from age but from the realization of how carefully I'd have to move going forward. The afternoon brought Karen's regular visit, and I used the time to plant seeds for the next phase of my plan. "I've been thinking about my funeral," I said while she helped me sort through old recipes, a task that required no help but gave us a reason to sit close together. "I know it's morbid, but at my age." I let the sentence trail off, watching her face carefully for any telltale signs of excitement or guilt. "Mom, don't talk like that," she said, but I caught the quick flash of interest in her eyes before she composed her expression into appropriate concern. "You're going to be around for years yet." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly it was almost impressive, if it hadn't been so personally devastating. This was the daughter I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, who'd crawled into my bed when nightmares scared her. Now she was counting down the days until my death with the patience of a vulture. "Still, I want to make sure things are handled the way I'd like," I continued, my voice taking on the querulous tone of an elderly person fixated on details. Closed casket, definitely. I don't want people staring at my old body. And cremation right after the service. I've always thought burial was such a waste of good land. I watched Karen's face brighten with each detail that aligned with their fraudulent plan. Her relief so obvious it made my stomach turn. Of course, Mom. Whatever you want. She patted my hand with false tenderness, probably calculating in her head how much easier I'd just made their scheme. They thought I was gift-wrapping their crime for them, providing the perfect cover story for why no one would ever see my supposedly dead body. What they didn't realize was that Margaret Sullivan was setting the stage for the greatest reveal of her career, and the audience was going to be very surprised indeed when the guest of honor showed up to her own funeral very much alive and ready to deliver justice. The call came on Wednesday evening, and I knew from Karen's theatrical gasp that the show had begun. "Oh my God," she breathed into the phone, her voice carrying just the right amount of shocked grief for whoever was on the other end. "When? How?" I listened from the top of the stairs, my heart racing despite knowing this was all performance. According to their timeline, Margaret Sullivan had just died in her sleep, peacefully and conveniently, right on schedule. From my hidden position, I watched Karen transform into the grieving daughter, tears flowing on command as she made call after call to relatives, friends, and most importantly, the insurance company. "Yes, she went peacefully," she repeated with each conversation. "No suffering, thank God. The funeral will be Thursday afternoon. She always said she wanted things handled quickly." Her acting was flawless, and if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been moved by her apparent sorrow. David arrived within an hour, his face set in the grim expression of a son dealing with his mother's sudden death. They embraced in the living room, consoling each other with whispered words about how unexpected this was, how they'd hoped for more time. The irony was thick enough to choke on. They'd been planning this moment for months, yet they performed surprise and grief like seasoned actors hitting their marks. Dr. Morrison appeared at 9 o'clock, black bag in hand and an expression of professional sympathy that made my skin crawl. From my hiding spot in the spare bedroom, I listened as he examined the empty bed where I was supposedly lying dead, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise as he pronounced time of death and cited natural causes. The death certificate was already prepared. All that remained was filling in the exact time and signing his name to their lies. But the most chilling moment came when they discussed the body. Karen had arranged for a private mortuary service, one that specialized in discreet handling for families who preferred minimal interaction with the deceased. No embalming, no viewing, no opportunity for anyone to discover that their coffin would be empty except for pillows arranged to approximate human shape. The cremation was scheduled for immediately after the funeral service, ensuring that any evidence of their fraud would literally go up in smoke. As midnight approached, I made my move. While Karen and David sat in the living room below, making final arrangements and probably celebrating their successful deception, I slipped out through the back door of my own house. The October air was sharp against my skin, but I felt more alive than I had in years. Margaret Sullivan was officially dead, but the woman who was about to attend her own funeral was very much alive and ready to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The safe house Ray Martinez had arranged was a small apartment across town, stocked with everything I'd need for the next 24 hours. Surveillance equipment, recording devices, and most importantly, the perfect disguise for a dead woman who planned to attend her own funeral. As I looked in the mirror at my new appearance, gray wig styled differently, makeup that aged me even further, clothes that made me look like just another elderly mourner, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, my children were about to learn that some performances have surprise endings, and this particular show was going to have a finale they'd never forget. Thursday dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed designed for funerals. From my position across the street from Mercy Chapel, I watched through binoculars as the hearse arrived, empty except for the weighted coffin that David and Karen had paid handsomely to have prepared. The mortuary had done excellent work. Even I was impressed by how authentic everything looked from the outside. Flowers lined the entrance, and a steady stream of mourners began arriving to pay their respects to Margaret Sullivan. My disguise was perfect. The gray wig was styled in a way I'd never worn my hair, and thick glasses obscured my eyes. I'd added padding to change my silhouette and practiced walking with a slight limp that was completely different from my usual gait. To anyone looking, I was just another elderly woman come to mourn an old friend. The irony of attending my own funeral wasn't lost on me, but the situation was far too serious for anything approaching humor. Detective Martinez and his team were positioned throughout the chapel, some in plain clothes as mourners, others outside monitoring the insurance investigators who'd come to observe the proceedings. Everything had to look completely authentic until the moment we sprung our trap. The insurance company had already expedited their initial investigation, so confident were they in Dr. Morrison's documentation of my declining health over the past months. Karen stood at the chapel entrance, receiving condolences with the perfect mixture of grace and grief. Her black dress was appropriately modest, her makeup carefully applied to enhance her red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you for coming," she repeated to each visitor, her voice breaking just enough to seem genuine. Mother would have been so touched to see how many people loved her. The words should have warmed my heart. Instead, they made my stomach turn with the knowledge of how calculating every gesture was. David positioned himself near the closed casket, playing the devoted son overcome by loss. I watched him accept handshakes and hugs from family friends, his face a mask of stoic grief that would have been touching if I hadn't known he was mourning the woman whose death had just made him wealthy. The insurance paperwork was already filed, the claim process begun, their alibis perfectly established by dozens of witnesses who could attest to their apparent devastation. The service began at 2 o'clock, and I slipped into a pew near the back, hidden among the genuine mourners who'd come to honor what they believed was my memory. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy about my life of service, my dedication to justice, my love for my family. The words were accurate and heartfelt, which made them even more painful to hear while watching my children nod tearfully at every mention of how much they'd meant to me. But as the pastor spoke about my career in investigation, about how I'd spent my life uncovering truth and bringing justice to those who'd been wronged, I felt a familiar fire building in my chest. Margaret Sullivan might be officially dead, but her final case was about to reach its conclusion. The woman sitting in that back pew, recording every moment of this elaborate fraud, was about to deliver the kind of justice that would make my entire career pale in comparison. My children wanted to bury me to get rich. They were about to learn that some people are very hard to keep in the ground. The moment arrived exactly as we'd planned it. Pastor Williams had just finished his eulogy and was asking if anyone wanted to share memories of Margaret Sullivan when I stood up in the back pew. The chapel fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against stained glass windows as I slowly made my way down the center aisle, removing my gray wig and thick glasses as I walked. Gasps rippled through the congregation as people recognized the supposedly dead woman approaching her own casket. Karen's face went white as hospital sheets when she saw me, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying clearly in the shocked silence of the chapel. "This isn't possible. You're. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the word dead, while I stood before her, very much alive and walking steadily toward the front of the room. "Hello, children," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's excellent acoustics. David had collapsed into a chair beside the casket, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and growing horror as he realized what my presence meant. "I hope you don't mind me attending my own funeral. After all, you did go to so much trouble to arrange it." The congregation buzzed with confused murmurs, but I held up a hand for silence. This was my show now. Detective Martinez stepped forward from where he'd been positioned among the mourners, his badge glinting in the chapel's soft lighting. "David Williams and Karen Williams, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, filing false death certificates, and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person." The Miranda rights echoed through the chapel as additional officers appeared from among the congregants, surrounding my children like a carefully choreographed dance. "This is insane," Karen screamed, her grief-stricken persona cracking completely. "She's supposed to be dead. Dr. Morrison signed the death certificate. She died in her sleep. Her voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the chapel walls, destroying any remaining pretense of the dignified daughter she'd been playing. You can't arrest us for mourning our dead mother. But I was ready for this moment, had been preparing for it since the night I first overheard their plans. From my purse, I pulled out a small recording device and set it on the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced to the shocked congregation, I'd like you to hear something. These are recordings of my children planning my death and discussing how to profit from it. Karen lunged toward me, but Detective Martinez caught her arm as the first recorded conversation began to play. David's voice filled the chapel, cold and calculating as he discussed life insurance payouts and property values. Karen's responses were equally damning, her casual discussion of cremation and closed caskets painting a clear picture of premeditated fraud. The congregation sat in stunned silence as months of conspiracy unfolded before them, each recorded word driving another nail into my children's coffins. The death certificate you're all holding as evidence, I continued as the recordings played, was signed by Dr. Morrison without ever examining a body. The casket behind me contains pillows and sandbags, not your supposedly grieving mother. And the insurance claim they filed this morning. Pure fraud, every single word of it. The insurance investigators in attendance were already making calls, their initial approval of the claim being reversed in real time as the evidence mounted. As my children were led away in handcuffs, their perfect plan crumbling around them like ancient paper, Karen turned back to me one last time. We're your children, she screamed, tears of rage rather than grief streaming down her face. How could you do this to us? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the magnitude of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me. These were the babies I'd raised, the children I'd sacrificed everything for, and they'd been willing to kill me for money. But then I remembered the recordings, the insurance papers, the casual way they discussed my cremation to hide evidence of their crimes. You stopped being my children the moment you decided I was worth more dead than alive, I replied, my voice steady despite the grief that was finally hitting me. I spent my life bringing justice to people who'd been betrayed by those they trusted. I never thought I'd have to bring that same justice to my own family. The chapel door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the silent room, leaving me standing alone beside my own empty casket, finally free but utterly heartbroken. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind my house, tending tomatoes that had never grown so well before. The insurance settlement had been substantial. Not only had the company returned every premium I'd ever paid, but they'd also awarded damages for the emotional distress of discovering my children's plot. Dr. Morrison had lost his medical license and faced criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. The funeral home that had participated in the empty casket scheme had been shut down permanently. Justice, as it turned out, had been very profitable. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of betrayal had been lifted from its walls. I donated David and Karen's childhood bedrooms to a local charity that helped elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. Their photos were gone from the mantel, replaced by certificates of appreciation from the seniors I'd been helping through my new consulting business. Margaret Sullivan Investigations was officially back in business, specializing in family fraud and elder abuse cases. My phone rang constantly now with calls from people who'd heard about the woman who'd attended her own funeral to catch her children committing insurance fraud. Some wanted to hire me to investigate their own suspicions about relatives. Others simply wanted to share their stories of family betrayal, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone. I'd become an accidental symbol of fighting back against those who prey on the elderly, and the responsibility felt both heavy and deeply satisfying. The most rewarding part of my new life was the support group I'd started at the community center. Every Tuesday evening, a dozen seniors would gather to share experiences and strategies for protecting themselves from financial exploitation. We called ourselves the survivors, and the stories we shared would have broken hearts if they hadn't also inspired such fierce determination. Margaret Sullivan might have died officially, but the woman who rose from her own ashes was stronger than she'd ever been. Detective Martinez had become a regular visitor, stopping by monthly to consult on elder abuse cases and to check on my well-being. "You know, Maggie," he said during one visit, "in 30 years of police work, I've never seen anything like what you pulled off. Attending your own funeral to catch the perpetrators. That's going to be legendary in law enforcement circles for decades." His admiration was genuine, but I knew the real victory wasn't in the cleverness of the trap. It was in the lives it had saved. The letters arrived daily from across the country. Seniors who'd found the courage to report suspicious family members. Adult children who'd realized they needed to protect their aging parents from less scrupulous siblings. Legal professionals who'd learned to look more carefully for signs of elder abuse in their cases. My story had become a catalyst for change, and knowing that my personal tragedy had prevented countless others from suffering the same betrayal gave meaning to the pain. On quiet evenings, I still thought about David and Karen sometimes. They were serving their sentences in separate facilities, their appeals denied, their reputations destroyed. I'd received exactly 2 letters from them, one from each, both demanding to know how I could have betrayed them so completely. I'd thrown both letters away unopened. Some relationships, once broken by greed and callousness, can never be repaired. But mostly I focused on the future. At 74, I was busier than I'd been in years, traveling to conferences, training other investigators, writing a book about family fraud that had already been optioned for a television movie. The woman who was supposed to be dead had never been more alive, and every morning I woke up grateful for the chance to fight for justice in a world that desperately needed it. As I sat on my back porch that evening, watching the sun set over the garden I'd never had to give up, I raised my coffee cup in a toast to the woman I'd become. Margaret Sullivan had died in that chapel 6 months ago, but from her ashes had risen someone stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. They'd wanted to bury me to get rich, but instead they'd freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.